Now, the long run aggregate supply curve. The LRAS, long run aggregate supply curve, is relating production, aggregate supply, to the price level. Well, in the long run, production is not a function of what the overall level of prices happens to be. It's a function of our ability to produce, which would be related to our resources, technology, infrastructure, those kind of things. And so this is very much associated with the concept of production possibility curve or frontier. So the LRAS represents being on the PPC or PPF curve of the economy. Or conversely, another very useful way of thinking about it is what is our level of production if all resources are fully employed? In other words, being on the lower aggregate supply curve, that's the level of real GDP that will support full employment. So wherever this vertical line hits the horizontal axis, that's always associated with full employment. So now we can put them together, them being the aggregate demand curve and the long run aggregate supply curve. And this in the long run determines the price level in the long run and the level of real GDP. Now, obviously, level of GDP is already determined by other factors unless we have economic growth. So this is, at this point, there's no economic growth. Okay. Now, what happens if there, for some reason, like there's an increase in the money supply? Well, that would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift up, but we're already producing at maximum. So the only thing that happens in the long run is just increasing the price level. If that's a sustained kind of thing, that would be inflation. So in the long run, the only thing that is impacted when there's a change in aggregate demand is the price level. Okay. Now, what happens though if we have economic growth? If we have economic growth, that would be a rightward shift in the long run aggregate supply curve. So one would think that just statically would go from point B to some point down here. But in reality, with increase in production, that means incomes have gone up. So what's going to happen to aggregate demand? It's going to shift. And so ideally, I should have really probably drawn another aggregate demand curve right here, an AD2, if you will. I think I may have that in my text-based notes. Ideally, we'd want economic growth, but with stable prices. Now, again, let me reiterate, by stable prices, I'm not talking about no price changes at all. We want prices to change at the market level to reflect supply and demand conditions for individual products. So, for example, if there's a storm and it wipes out the orange crop, markets would dictate that the price goes up so that we can economize better on oranges. So that's the way you need to think about it. It's overall level prices, inflation rates, not individual prices. Now we come to the short run aggregate supply curve, and the short run aggregate supply curve is probably the most confusing curve, at least the way I do it. I'm sorry, what can I say? Of all the graphs in macroeconomics, at least at the beginning level. So unlike what the e-text states about the short run aggregate supply curve, maybe just having a positive slope, just one shape, there's at least 3 and maybe 4 shapes, depending on the current condition of the economy. Now, let me backtrack on this. Okay. A lot of the books will relate the short run aggregate supply curve to suppliers, producers' expectation of the inflation rate. In other words, the expected rate of inflation. That's probably a more accurate way of doing it. But in my opinion, humble opinion, it's much more simple to do it the way I'm going to do it. So the short run aggregate supply curve has a flat portion, a positively sloped portion, a portion that's pretty vertical. And then this region right here, you don't see this in any textbook. This is my own idea of a backward bending short run aggregate supply curve. Let me explain what's going on here. This flat portion, sometimes called a Keynesian range, let me go ahead and go there. So this is often called the Keynesian range. That's associated, the way I'm going to present it, with an economy that's either in a deep recession or maybe even in a depression. And so there's a lot of idle capacity. Factories are shut down, people are unemployed. And if for some reason people start buying more, that would actually be the aggregate demand curve. But I want to concentrate on the short run aggregate supply curve right now. But in effect, if the aggregate demand starts shifting to rightward through this region, I should say, then because of all the slack in the economy, it's not going to cost much of anything to start back up the production. So you see an increase in production, GDP, without any increase in the overall level of prices. However, as we start getting, and by the way, let me backtrack. This would be associated with points deep inside the production possibility frontier or curve. However, as we get closer back to being on the curve itself, being back to full employment, now there's not all that many unemployed resources. Most people that want to work are working. And so we can increase our production to match an increase in aggregate demand, but its costs are going to start rising. And so our retail prices, think of these as retail prices for GDP, will start increasing as well. So that's the positively sloped. Now, at some point, we're just going to hit in the short run, notice this is short run, we're going to hit a barrier where we can absolutely domestically not produce anymore stuff. Yeah, everybody's working that wants to work. As a matter of fact, maybe they're working overtime, they're working 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. And so all that can happen is if aggregate demand increases, prices will accelerate, they'll go up. And then, in my opinion, that's not sustainable in the long run. I know this is short run, but that's not sustainable. So eventually, prices and production will tail back off. Production, anyway, will tail back off as prices continue to rise until we get to a more sustainable level. So, talked about the Keynesian range. That's the flat portion. Intermediate range, that's the positively sloped portion. The classical or monstrous range, that's that vertical range, and then that backward bending short run average supply curve, that's my range. Okay, I'm not going to test you on that part, on the M part, but I will the others. So when you have a shift in the short run average supply curve, the easiest way, in my opinion, to think about those shifts is that wholesale costs are changing. Okay, now I know that I just kind of talked about the straining on the economy and cost rising. That's kind of after the fact. Here I'm talking about, for example, like a pandemic happens, or there's widespread weather conditions that happen. Something other than the dynamics of the economy are causing costs to go up or down. Well, in that case, the short run average supply curve of costs are rising. I'm talking about wholesale costs. That's going to ultimately impact retail prices and costs, causing a leftward shift or vice versa if costs go down. So ideally, we would want to look at being in both long run and short run equilibrium. The way I have this shown is point A. In my text-based notes, I think I'll label this as HD for hunky-dory. That's what I call it in actual lecture classes. Everything's pretty good. We have a little inflation. It's 105 as opposed to 100, but we're at full employment because we're on the vertical long-run average supply curve. Things are pretty good. Okay, so the way you want to think about this is a reference point. This is where we want to be. So what happens if aggregate demand decreases for whatever reason? Decrease in the money supply, people are more pessimistic, lots of reasons why aggregate demand could shift to the left. Well, that's going to cause, by the way, that initial shift would probably be somewhere in here, and then that multiplier effect, remember, would ultimately make us end up at, say, point B. This would be the way most recessions happen. In other words, make sure you understand most recessions are caused by a drop in total spending. It's a decrease in spending that generally causes most typical, if you will, recessions. Now, when I say typical, we could certainly illustrate this with aggregate expenditure model too. Okay. However, this is part that we won't be able to understand. Eventually, okay, as those retail prices have to come down and less retail goods are purchased from the wholesalers, those wholesalers are going to have to drop their prices too. And they can actually, their costs will probably go down because they can be pickier on the workers that they hire or don't let go. Maybe they're the more productive ones, lots of reasons. But wholesale costs will start to fall as well. When that happens, the short run average supply curve will shift to the right, and lo and behold, we might get back to full employment, but at a lower price level. Now, something I didn't really spell out is, remember, being on the long run average supply curve is associated with full employment. The farther to the left that we go from the long run average supply curve, the higher the unemployment rate. So that's associated. So recession, lower output. Whoops, sorry, got click happy there. Lower output and higher unemployment rates. But given time, the economy will move back to point C. The real debate between what we call Keynesian economists and modern neoclassical, or you have post-Keynesian and post-classical, neoclassical. The real debate is that how long does this take? Does it take a long time? Then maybe there's something that needs to be done about getting us back to point A. If it really doesn't take too long for this process to happen, maybe we just wait till point C. That's really the gist of the whole debate, which we'll talk about later. Demand pull. This is the typical kind of inflation. The economy's at full employment, doing pretty well, but for whatever reason, aggregate demand increases. For example, an increase in overall money supply. Maybe countries in other countries are buying much more of our exported goods, for example. So that would be a rightward shift in the demand curve. Notice what's happening is prices are going up. That's inflation. However, incomes, remember this is income and production, they're going up. So it's a pretty decent economy just with rising prices. However, those rising retail prices will cause wholesale costs to rise too, as there's more strain on the resource purchases. More are purchased, harder to extract natural resources, those kind of things, because there's more and more that the retailers are wanting of the produced items. And so that'll cause a leftward shift as wholesale costs go up, and lo and behold, moves us back to point E. Now, admittedly, there's some good inflation. I don't mean good in the sense of value-wise, but there's a good amount of inflation, because from A to D and then D to E, but we do pull back to a sustainable level at point E. So that's the typical inflation. However, in the 1970s and early 1980s, we had an atypical situation. It was associated with what's called cost push inflation. So the inflation was not caused by an increase in aggregate demand. That would be this one here, shifting from point A up to this other aggregate demand curve. But in the country, there was a tremendous surge in wholesale cost related to a couple of things. First of all, there was bad weather throughout the world. It was really a bad year for weather. So a lot of the commodities, especially agricultural commodities, it was the supply was way down, prices went up of commodities in general. But then also OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, put an embargo on the United States. So oil prices were highly restricted and they shot through the roof, relatively speaking. And so oil is such an important component in transportation, but also in all kinds of other stuff, plastics, you name it. And it's found in almost everything in modern life. And so wholesale costs really went way up. So we moved from point A to point F. Well, what's happening here? We have a recession, real GDP is falling from 17 to maybe 16 and a half. But at the very same time, the price level is going up, so we have inflation. So we have a stagnant economy with inflation. So what we've done is given and I know this seems like a long one, but given a very brief discussion about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And the point you need to get out of this is this model can adequately explain about all the issues that come up in the macro economy. So that's why it's a useful model.